Today we're talking about the Flower Celebration, which is an annual event in many Unitarian Universalist churches. This whole concept was thought up and started in the 1920s by a man named Norbert Čapek. Very interesting character in Czechoslovakia. Čapek was born, as we noticed from the hymn book, in 1870. His father was an agnostic and his mother was a devout Catholic. And he was a boy with always a spiritual bent to him. He was an acolyte. He was raised in the church and stayed active with it, but became a little disillusioned with a cynical priest. And he came to a new church that was fairly unusual in Czechoslovakia called Baptists, and became a committed Baptist and actually grew to be a minister. He was involved in the early years of the IARF, International Association for Religious Freedom, which was actually founded by Unitarians, but he was involved with it as a Baptist in Czechoslovakia. Eventually he came to the U.S. in the teens and served a couple of Baptist churches in New Jersey. But after the war, he resigned from being a Baptist minister and started attending a Unitarian church. He'd been becoming more and more liberal all along, and it's worth noting that what led him and his wife to the Unitarian church was their children who really liked the religious education program. So there, the children were leading to parents. And after the war, he went back to Czechoslovakia. He had become, well, I say back to Czechoslovakia. Czechoslovakia had just been created, because when he was born during his early life, it was part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. And so now, after World War I, it was a free country. He had become a Unitarian and went back to his country, to the new country with a new church, and founded the Unitarian Church in Czechoslovakia. And it grew. His congregation grew to be the largest church, the largest Unitarian church in the world, with over 3,000 members. There were 8,000 Unitarians in Czechoslovakia in the 20s and 30s. And the church he created, his theology was very bright, it was very optimistic. He was a real believer in progress and the value of education, how education could just change the world. At the same time, the secular reality around him was deteriorating terribly. I mean, we all know a little bit about the Depression in the United States. It was worse in Czechoslovakia. It started earlier and went deeper, and they were in desperate, terrible times. I mean, they were saddled with these war debts they couldn't pay. There was rampant inflation. The economy really was all to pieces. And as we know, sometimes when the economy is really bad, there are people who will take advantage of it. The country became polarized. And in March of 1939, in Prague, where he lived, the Nazis came in from Germany, and Bohemia and Moravia became a protectorate of Nazi Germany. Later that year, of course, we know that the Germans declared war on Poland. They invaded Poland. We have a tendency, I think, sometimes to think that sort of the World War II started on December 7th, 1941. Well, it had been going on for 2 years already in Europe. We were actually kind of late into it. So it starts in 39. And here he is, a Unitarian minister in Prague, under Nazi domination, and a war going on. Well, in March 28, 1941, Norbert Čapek and his youngest daughter, Zora, were arrested and charged with listening to enemy broadcasts. The BBC was an enemy broadcast, and it was a capital offense to listen to enemy radio. His daughter was hauled off and sent to a labor camp, and he was charged as well, but not just with listening to enemy broadcasts, but with high treason. And his sermons, some of his sermons were entered as evidence of treason. I wonder how many people that would apply to today, how many of us could be tried for treason on the basis of our sermons. Well, it was still within public courts, and so he was convicted of treason. He appealed it and won on appeal. However, the Gestapo didn't worry about details like that. They took him anyway and sent him to Dachau, into the prison camps. He was there. We know that he was put on a train for Linz, and on October the 12th, 1942, was put into the gas chambers and killed. Poison gas was the price of Unitarianism for Norbert Chapek. He is a martyr. I don't know if there was anything he could have done to get out of it. But he's not the only person. We normally don't think a whole lot about Unitarian or Universalist martyrs, but if we go way back, I think of like Michael Servetus. Some people have at least heard of him. Servetus, in the 1500s, right after the Protestant Reformation, when all of a sudden we could read books, he had got a good education, and he read the Bible. And he says, I don't see a Trinity in here. And he wrote a book called On the Errors of the Trinity. And being young and brash and liberal, like a few people I've known in my life, he sends a copy of it to John Calvin. Read this, John. You'll see how that I'm right and you're wrong. And of course, since I have the better argument, you'll just become a non-Trinitarian like me. Didn't quite work out that way. He has several careers. But he basically has to change his name. He's also a medical doctor, so he has a long career as a doctor. When someone outs him to the French Inquisition, there were Inquisitions in every country, he's arrested and escapes. I mean, somebody really needs to do a mini-series on Michael Servetus. He escapes, allegedly helped by the daughter of the man whose house where he was being held. And he was able to climb over a wall and get away. The only trouble is, now he's on the run in southern France, but not the southern coast. He wants to get to Italy, where he knows there's a haven of liberals. But to get to Italy, he's going to have to go through Switzerland, which means going through Geneva, where Calvin rules. He's recognized and caught and arrested in Geneva and tried for heresy and convicted. The pro-Calvin people will always say, well, Calvin didn't really want him burned at the stake. Right. Calvin said, well, maybe we should only cut his head off. So I guess, cold chop being better than hot steak, which is actually a line from the Three Stooges that stuck in my head. But, dead is dead. But Calvin doesn't pardon him, and he is burned at the stake. And I would say something, the less pleasant part about this, if you look at the old woodcuts of people being burned at the stake, frequently if you look at them, they've got this bag hanging around their neck. This was an act of mercy. The bag was full of gunpowder, so that they would go faster. If you're being burned alive, the faster the better. They burned Servetus with green wood to make it as slow as possible. And here's the thing about Servetus. He could have recanted at any minute. I mean, there are people with him as he's being marched to the stake saying, essentially, if you say, okay, I'm sorry, I didn't mean it, yes, I'm a Trinitarian, here, I'll help you burn my books, they would have let him go. But he didn't. It has to do with values and priorities. To him, his religious beliefs in the unity of God, as opposed to a Trinity, was more important than his own life. So he gave it up. And I wonder, what would we do in that particular time? I had a chance to teach Unitarian heritage and values for a while at a leadership school. And I would always ask them, because we've seen this happen in other countries. A lot of us get almost like paranoid, like, oh, the religious light's going to take over, it's going to be terrible oppression, Yeah, sure, I don't think it's going to happen. But what if it did happen? And they said, okay, we're now going to be an official Christian country. Some Unitarians say they're not Christians, and so you guys don't count. So you can hang around, but you're just going to have to pay special taxes. It's like Christians and Muslims, or Christians and Jews do it in Muslim countries. you pay the special tax and you can go and be okay. Or what if they decide, well, yeah, it's okay, but the taxes really aren't enough. We don't trust you folks, so we're going to disfranchise you and just take away the vote. Or perhaps owning property gives you too much power, and so we're just going to confiscate all your property. Or perhaps we need to imprison you guys. Or perhaps we just need to execute you. At what point, I wonder, would any of us recant our beliefs, assuming we have them? What is important? What would we sacrifice? What are our priorities? And thinking of Chopek puts me in mind of this. And I think about sacrifice. Now there's a novel topic for a UU sermon. I mean, when was the last time you heard somebody preach on sacrifice? It's right up there with sin. We just don't talk about it. Because, of course, it's not a problem with us. We don't ever have to worry about this. Well, that word itself, sacrifice, I mean, the root word, is sacre, it means sacred. And actually, sacrifi is to make sacred. What is made sacred? What would we make sacred to think that is more important than something else? Well, I did the usual. I opened up the dictionary, and they had 3 definitions for sacrifice. One of them, that we're fairly familiar with, a strictly religious one, an old one, is the act of offering something to a deity in propitiation or homage, especially the ritual slaughter of an animal or person. To propitiate or homage. Interesting. A lot of ancient religions were based on fear, and so you propitiated the gods. We're going to offer a sacrifice in hopes that you won't take it out on us. The more positive form of sacrifice was we honor the gods and hope that the gods will honor us as well because of what we're doing. That gets a little more balance in it. As Paul Woodruff wrote in his book on reverence, the importance of ceremony to virtue is that it is a language of behavior for recognizing a hierarchy and keeping it benign. That's the God. We're going to be nice to the gods. We're going to go through the ceremony, and maybe we can have a benign relationship. But we don't do that kind of sacrifice anymore. The third definition, I'm going to skip number 2 for a while. The third definition is the relinquishment of something at less than presumed value. This is what we hear a lot. Sacrifice sale. We're letting this stuff go cheap. It's less than retail. It's even maybe less than wholesale. We're going to give away something that's cheaper than it would have normally cost. Well, nothing sacred there. That's for sure. But what about that second definition? This is kind of interesting, I think. The forfeiture of something highly valued for the sake of one considered to have greater value or claim. So you're taking something that's highly valued and you're giving it up for something yet higher. Probably not a direct benefit to yourself, but this is really important to me, but I'm willing to let it go because this is more important. Perhaps not just to me, but to a larger world, because we have some sense of honor. There's another word we don't use very often. I guess maybe just because I'm a Southerner, I think it's a fairly important word. So what is it that's up there? And sacrifice, I think, is really just necessary. If we're ever going to grow, spiritually or any other way, we're going to have to experience sacrifice. It's part of living. There are things between heaven and earth, my dear Horatio, that are bigger than you are. There are things that are more valuable than ourselves. Aren't there? Last night I talked with a friend of mine. Met this person, gosh, back in the early 80s. And we saw each other a few times and got to be friends. And then I went off to graduate school, and they went on with their life. And we were both involved with Appalachian Studies. And I saw them 2 or 3 times over the years. The next time I saw her, she was married. Married a cop. That's interesting. We were old hippies at one time. And had a kid. And I didn't see her for years and years and years. I ran into her actually at a memorial service in Boone back in August. She was singing. She knew the professor. He was somebody that I had known professionally and had a great deal of admiration for. And we talked, and she was a widow. Her husband died untimely and unexpectedly about 1.5 years ago, leaving her with a daughter in high school who's graduating in spring. As I talked to her, she says, well, just for the last couple of years, I just had to take my life and put it on hold. Because my daughter, she was a daddy's girl. She was, he was her heart, she said. And she was just at loose ends. She didn't know what to do. And so I just had to take everything that I wanted to do, something of great value to me in my life, essentially, and just put it on hold. Because I had to get her through this difficulty. I had to get her through school, and she's going somewhere else now. She's actually going to get married, and it's going to be okay. But she just took a couple of years of her life, and essentially, other than making a living to support them, put everything else on hold because her daughter and her welfare was more important than she and her welfare were. She made a legitimate sacrifice. Now, I'm not talking about inconvenience. A lot of times when we talk about sacrificing this or sacrificing that, we're talking about inconveniences. It's sort of like, it's like the guy says, can you believe it, my son's getting married the first weekend in June, and he should know that that's when my frat brothers and I always get together once a year and have a big golf weekend in South Carolina. And I'm going to have to sacrifice that. What does he think he's doing? That's not a sacrifice. It's an inconvenience. So what is sacrifice? And what would you sacrifice? Perhaps more important, what would you sacrifice for? What is it that you have that you value highly? And I hope it's not just your money. That you would give up for something you considered more important than that. What's bigger than you are? What is of greater value? What is of worth that you would sacrifice for it? We might even say, what would you make sacred by sacrificing it? Now, this is not an in-class pop quiz. This is a take-home essay to think about. I look at Norbert Chapek, and he was a martyr. There's one thing about martyrs that you need to know. No martyrs ever want to be one. You're something else. I think there's a diagnosis for that. But nobody sets out to be a martyr. It's just that they make a choice, as he did, as people in our past have. We're going to take part in a ceremony in a few minutes after we do the offering that we call the flower celebration that Chapek created. And it's a ceremony. The importance of ceremony to virtue is that it is a language of behavior for recognizing a hierarchy and keeping it benign. Well, what hierarchy are we recognizing? Part of that is the lack thereof. We're a free church. We believe that every member of the church has equal voice. That's the way we do things. Everybody got the same vote. We use a democratic process. We do it for theological reasons. Some people may earn respect or admiration, but they don't have more than one vote. That's what we recognize. Because as we came in, those of you who knew what was going to happen, some of you don't, but that's okay. We bring in a flower, and that flower represents us as a unique individual, beautiful in and of itself, of intrinsic worth. And what we're going to do in the ceremony is each of us will come up and take a flower different than the one we brought in. Now, we don't know who brought that flower in, but each one of those flowers represents a member of the congregation. When Chopek started doing this, Unitarians used to take the summer off, and what he would do, they would do it on the last service of the church year. It was about the 1st of June. Flowers come out a little later in Prague. And everybody would essentially, it was symbolic, everybody would come in, they would put their flowers into one big urn, the congregation, and then they'd leave, they would take a flower out, you know, sort of symbolically to remember members of the congregation when they weren't together. And that's what we're doing. That's the ceremony. We're recognizing the beauty of each and every one of us. And what it is to take them. I mean, you don't know whose flower it is, and that's, I think, important. We're not one, oh, I want their flower. No, it's a flower which represents a member, or friend, or visitor. Everybody gets to take a flower. There's more than enough, and we all know who's responsible for that, don't we? Our own flower girl. So, it is about free church ecclesiology, just to use one big word. The flowers are unique and beautiful, and the flowers going out are in remembrance of any and all the members of this congregation. This congregation, which is something I would venture to say is greater than the worth of any one of us, although we are all a part of it. So may it be. Amen.